Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Montefiore Graduate Awards Winners Scholarly Seminar, organized and held under the auspices of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies at Concordia University. My name is Csaba Nikolényi. I'm a professor at the Department of Political Science at Concordia University and also director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. And it is such a delight to welcome a number of professors, a number of scholars, members of the community associated with the Azrieli Institute, joining us today in this wonderful scholarly celebration. It is a celebration as we are marking 4 bright, promising graduate students who received the Institute's prestigious Montefiore Graduate Awards for the previous academic year. And it is also going to be an intellectual feast, if you will, because according to our time-honored tradition, we ask our award winners to give us a short presentation at a scholarly panel. And so according to that tradition, we are now going to have a 4-paper presenting on the research for about 15 minutes. So with your permission, I would like to read a short introduction about each of the awardees. I will do so in the order according to which they will then proceed to present their papers. When we have finished with the 4th presentation, the virtual floor, that is the chat room on Zoom, is going to be open for your questions. And we can be flexible in terms of time, but I imagine that about 15 to 20 minutes should be sufficient to engage and entertain all the questions that you might have. But if we need to go a little bit over time, that is certainly not going to be a problem. And again, I just want to remind everyone again that this is such a joyous and happy occasion. And more importantly than anything, I really want to congratulate each of the 4 graduate students whom I'm going to now introduce and from whom in a couple of minutes you are going to be hearing on their important research. So let me start with Lucas Cober, who is going to be our first presenter. Lucas is a PhD student currently at Concordia University's Department of Religions and Cultures. His research focuses on disabled characters in the Bible and their interpretation history. He's also very interested in the way which biblical interpreters have used ideas of the marginalized to construct the boundaries of acceptable humanity generally, and the way that picture Bibles for children interpret and translate biblical stories. The second presentation is going to be given by Eliot Mason. Elliot is also a PhD candidate at Concordia University's Department of Religions and Cultures, where he studies monsters, the monstrous, and their relationship with issues of marginalization and the other. Eliot's research also engages with the intersection of pop culture, religion, and politics. It's very appropriate that, of course, the Department of Political Science is one of our partners alongside with the Department of Religions and Cultures in organizing this event. Our third presentation is going to be given by Sara Sharpe. Sara is currently completing her master's degree, and I am to understand that she has already completed actually her master's degree in Judaic Studies at Concordia, and she will be starting her PhD at the same department, at the Department of Religions and Cultures, in the fall. Sara has received numerous scholarships and awards for her research, amongst others, the very prestigious Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Doctoral Scholarship. And her research employs intersectional, feminist, queer, and critical race theories in order to analyze the function of friendship among underrepresented groups within Jewish communities. Our 4th presentation is going to be given by our political scientist, Issam Banifadel. Issam is currently a PhD student. He joined An-Najjar National University in 2002 and graduated in 2006 with a bachelor's degree in business administration. Issam then undertook graduate studies in political science and earned a master's degree in political planning and development from that same university. In 2012, he enrolled at McGill University and finished a graduate diploma in human resources management. In January joined Concordia's Masters of Public Policy and Public Administration program, which is my department in political science. And he graduated from that program in 2017. In 2019, Issam joined the PhD program in political science, and he's currently working on indigenous peoples and Middle Eastern politics. His PhD dissertation is tentatively titled Self-Determination in Comparative Context, a comparative study between the indigenous peoples of Canada and the stateless Palestinians. And as you will hear in a few minutes, or rather I should say in about 45 minutes, Issam is going to explain and show us the importance of this project that shows some of the common denominators that connect the two groups that he's investigating and he's researching. So friends, our awardees, dear colleagues, without further ado, let me turn the festive floor and the virtual table over to our first presenter, Lucas Cober. Lucas, take it away.
Hi, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Dr. McElhenney, and thank you to the Institute for hosting this talk and also for giving me a lot of money. I really appreciate that, as does my landlord at my grocery store. So thank you, and thank you especially to Jennifer for I am just going to briefly start. The text was on the screen a few seconds ago, but I do just want to briefly start with an acknowledgement that Concordia University is also on unceded Indigenous territory of the Kahnawake Nation, as is the whole city of Montreal, and that we are all sort of to be able to have access to that land. I'm getting a message that I do. I'm going to read from you of my PhD, in fact just 15 minutes long, we do and with animals. So good morning, everyone. What I would say if I was giving this talk an hour ago, then Isaac.
We seem to have lost Lucas.
Back. Hello.
Oh, there he is.
Hello.
Maybe if you turn off video, it might help with the connection.
I am not entirely sure what happened there. Sure. Is that better?
Go ahead. Let's give that a try.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, so sorry about that. I guess my internet connection is not as good as I thought it was in this room. Okay, I don't know if you heard any of what I said before, but I'm just going to start the paper instead of giving the long rambling introduction again. Okay, so there's no character in any biblical text who's more disabled than Isaac. This isn't a comment about the severity of his disabilities or a value judgment about the nature of his impairments. Isaac goes famously blind in his old age, allowing himself to be deceived in chapter 27 of Genesis, which is the text I'm going to be analyzing in this talk. But his disability, I argue, runs previous to that. Throughout his life, Isaac is associated with identities that preclude him from the category of the able-bodied, such as childhood, then old age, and also a relationship with non-human animals. These all sort of conspire in the character of Isaac to disable him repeatedly at the hands of the text narrator and in the opinions of the other characters through the use of sort of gaps in the text and other literary techniques to orient the reader's thinking. And then finally, in the minds of the majority of the text interpreters as well. These axes of marginality are perhaps obvious, but I think that Isaac's lifelong association with non-human animals, and especially with livestock, is a little bit less so. And so that's why I sort of have a strong focus on that in this paper. This paper is going to read against the interpretive grain and consider Isaac's disability in relation to his association with non-human animals, and argue for an interpretation of the story that, instead of centering around Isaac's supposed sort of failings and lack of ability to do things, reconceptualizes the presumed boundary between human and non-human as one that is far more porous than most humans would prefer to admit, and as being a boundary that sort of uses the disabled body as a watermark, as a sort of high watermark to compare, a comparative to, so that we can know sort of what is a quote unquote normal body and what isn't. So again, I want to, hopefully this is going to be coherent for everyone. It is a chapter of my thesis sort of project, which I've shortened so that it can be a 15-minute talk. And I also want to apologize to Dr. Cohn, who is in the audience, because he is my thesis supervisor and has read this chapter many, many times and is probably going to be really bored. But hopefully the rest of you will not be. The question of the utility of boundaries raises for me the issue of whether disability and animality are simply narrative devices, or whether they have epistemological value for these texts. That is to ask, are these stories that are ripe with disabled characters and non-human animals simply there to sort of fulfill a requirement of the plot, or are these figures, these animals and disabled people, saying something meaningful about the roles of these identities, broadly speaking? The line I have here is that the answer to this question will become clear through my analysis below, but I probably shouldn't say that quite so definitively. But I'm argue that disability and animality do play important roles in the story, and also do comment on the value of actual people and actual non-human animals, and that but my argument and my interpretation, which I may not get into a lot of here, is that the representation of these things, of these marginalities, is ultimately neutral in many biblical texts, including this one. These are both extremely important and highly politicized markers, but in this case, they're also simple features of the characters. They carry no necessary epistemological value of their own without sort of being interpreted. I'm gesturing a lot and like doing the thing that I do when I'm teaching, and then I just remember that my camera's off. So hopefully my voice is interesting enough. In order to make this argument, it is necessary for me to formulate a quick vocabulary through which we can talk about disability and animality in a coherent manner. So I'm going to talk just a little bit for a couple of minutes about theory and some theorists who I'm using, or one particular theorist who I'm using, and that theorist is Mel Chen. Mel Chen is the author of the monograph Animacies, which if I were on camera, I would hold up and show you. And this book is dedicated to thinking about the concept of animacy, the ways in which certain forms of life are imbued with, what in some traditions are called souls or subjectivity or these sorts of things, and which Chen calls animacy. Drawing on the work of various philosophers, including, but not limited to, Aristotle and people going even further back than that. Foregrounding animacy as a concept allows Chen to consider these sort of loci of oppression, because it's often along a hierarchy of animacy that they find marginality occurs. And though their work is not specifically concerned with disability, the intersections with my field are clear. Chen argues that typically animacy, which is to say the status of ensoulment or some other nebulous concept by which we determine an entity to be alive, is measured on a binary, leaving some humans and most non-human animals with the status of not animate, quote, and therefore stereotyped as passive, as not having agency and control in their own lives. Chen proposes, and this is the premise of their book, that animacy may be considered a spectrum instead, with seemingly inert materials like rocks or metals, quote, scaled near zero, but not denoted as necessarily inanimate, because they don't find that definition to be helpful. This allows Chen's reader to interrogate the ways in which animacy as a concept is mobilized as a discourse of race, ability, subjectivity, and humanity. I'm going to read a fairly lengthy quote from Chen, which I don't like to do, but it's important because it kind of hopefully will get at what I think is important about this and why I'm talking about this person. So they write on page 95 of their book, as existing scholarship tells us from many different disciplinary sites, and indeed as everyday language practices also confirm, vivid links, whether live or long-standing, continue to be drawn between immigrants, people of color, laborers and working class subjects, colonial subjects, women, queer subjects, disabled people, and animals, meaning not in the class of creatures that includes humans, but quite the converse, the class against which the often rational human with inviolate and full subjectivity is defined. So that's all one very long run-on sentence, but that's fine, because I didn't write it. So using an animate/inanimate binary that casts non-human animals and many humans as no more than occasional subjects, there remains little room to argue, except to argue against the premise itself, as Chen does. Chen follows that comment by stating on another page that this latter characteristic exposes why animals have been so useful as figures, since they stand in for the intermediary zone between human and non-human states, and for the field of debate around the appropriateness of human and inhumane treatment. And so the basic premise that they're arguing against here, or that they're talking about here, is that the use of non-human animals rhetorically, that is in stories and in discussions of the way humans are treated, is used to justify the behavior, the treatment of certain types of humans, certain types of marginalized human, and the sort of comparisons between non-human animals and certain types of marginalized human are quite prolific. You see them quite frequently, and I'm not going to reiterate Chen's entire book here, but they're quite frequent. That is to say that non-human animals are useful objects for policing the boundaries of what makes a full human subject. It's also for this reason that's the reason that I'm talking so much about non-human animals, and in my interpretation of the text, I am going to include them so much. My research is focused mostly on disability and on the representation of disability in texts, but recently I've become very sort of aware of the ways in which these associations between disabled individuals and other people who are marginalized, are so heavily imbricated in the association, in sort of the construction of non-human animals as well, and the sort of construction of human identity through non-human animals. I'm not going to go heavily into this here because it's very dense, but I also use Mel Chen alongside a theorist called Jasper K. Poir, whose work on what she calls debility furthers Chen's use of animacy. Debility for Poir is a status under which certain bodies categorized by type, some form of type, are marked for disability from inception. Disability, she argues, is not a naturally occurring phenomenon, or not always a naturally occurring phenomenon, but is frequently imposed on people and groups of people by states, by the state. So she talks a lot about, for example, Black communities in the United States, where water quality and poor access to healthcare are systemic, and police violence are systemic infrastructural issues that mean people are more likely to develop chronic illnesses and less likely to have access to services that might help them, and are more likely to be harmed by the state. She also talks a great deal about, at great length in her book, The Right to Maim, about Israel's settler colonial policies towards Palestine and the repeated human rights abuses that the state of Israel justifies by marking Palestinian people as debilitated and therefore able to be disabled without consequences. And she talks a lot about the Israeli army's sort of no-kill policy that they ostensibly have regarding Palestinian sort of militants and civilians, in which they aim to actually maim people, to cause them to be disabled rather than to kill them. So you'll recall the lengthy quote that I read just a few minutes ago, in which Chen talks about the links between various groups of marginalized people, including racialized people, colonized people, and disabled people, and non-human animals. And hopefully it's clear why I'm including all of these things in one conversation, because that's the end of the third sort of theoretical introduction, and I'm just going to go into it. So if you're not on board, then I am sorry. It's probably my fault for not explaining it well. So Genesis 27, the text in question, is the story of the deception of Isaac. This is a story in which Isaac's son and his wife conspire to deceive him in order to give Jacob his blessing, and to pass on the sort of patrilineal patriarchal sort of power and sort of covenant with God onto Jacob instead of Jacob's older brother Esau, in sort of a reversal of what would be expected in a system that uses primogeniture for inheritance. So Genesis 27 opens with Isaac's disability. The very first line is, when Isaac was old and his eyes were so dim that he could not see. So it's unclear exactly what the text mean when it says that Isaac's eyes were dim. Forms of this verb are occasionally associated with blindness in other biblical texts, but they're also associated with a general weakness or physical failure, such as in Isaiah and Ezekiel. It's also generally used to sort of refer to a failure, for example, in the book of Samuel. The clearest association for me that's being drawn here is actually an association with a different character, with Moses, who we're told when he dies that his eyes did not dim. The same verb is being used. So there's a distinction being drawn there, and I'm not going to go into Isaac and Moses, but there's a whole thing. So this first verse sort of ends with Isaac sort of calling for his older son Esau, claiming that he's about to die and that he wants Esau to go out and get him some meat. I'm not gonna go through the text line by line because that'll be really uninteresting for most of you, but So Esau goes out and gets this game meat, and Isaac has requested this meat. This is not a part of the actual sort of blessing transference ritual. You don't see this happening anywhere else in Genesis, somebody asking for a specific type of food, a specific type of animal to be brought to them to consume. Isaac's insistence, though, on game meat sets this rest of the plot in motion, because Esau, having left, Isaac's wife Rebecca, who is listening at the tent, sort of now knows what's happening, and she goes to Jacob, her younger son, who she loves, with a plan. And she says, she reports the conversation almost verbatim to Jacob, and then says, "Now therefore, my son, obey my word as I command you. Go to the flock and get me 2 choice kids, so that I may prepare from them savory food for your father, such as he likes, and you shall take it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies." They're going to give Isaac the food that he's asked for, and he's going to give the blessing to the wrong son. Anybody who's familiar with this story knows that this deception works. Jacob puts on goat's fur on his arms in order to disguise himself as Esau. He brings the goat soup or the goat stew to Isaac, and Isaac eats it. Isaac, for all that he's apparently a lover of game meat, doesn't seem to understand that. Doesn't seem to recognize the taste of different types of meat. He doesn't seem to know that goat and deer or whatever the game meat in the area are don't actually taste the same. So despite the fact that he's asked for this, it sort of comes across almost as though he were trying to send Esau away, and it's as if he were sort of using this idea of game meat, these animals, as an excuse to do so. The other argument that I have that is quite off topic, so I'm not going to get too much into it, is that Isaac has this sort of lifelong association with livestock, because if you are familiar with Isaac's stories at all, you know his most famous story of the Akedah, where he is taken up to the mountain to be sacrificed, and then he is not sacrificed because he is quite notably replaced with a ram that they find in a thicket. And some scholars have argued that it's possible that this ram is actually a later narrative interpretation, later narrative redaction, in which an original version of the story exists in which Isaac actually was sacrificed, and then a narrator quite literally changed the story so that a ram was sacrificed instead. Over the course of this story, Isaac is compared both to the ram and to a lamb, and he also takes the place conceptually of a donkey at various points in the story. So he is taking the place of various sort of livestock or pack animals throughout the course of this story, and then we sort of see that association with animals continuing in Genesis 27. And my sort of broader argument here is that Isaac is actually uncomfortable eating livestock animals because he associates himself so heavily with them. Because he is a disabled sort of individual, the fact that the text really, really intensely is associating him with these non-human animals is really quite, I'm sorry, it's very hot in this room, is really quite critical for me, because we have a narrator who is associating this blind individual with, he's obviously not only disabled, but he's also associating him very heavily with several different livestock animals, all of which are kind of being conflated. And then we see other people sort of giving into this impulse and saying, yes, we will also sort of associate Isaac with animals. I see that I have only a little bit of time left, so I guess I'll wrap up. But essentially the fundamental argument of what I am getting at with all of this is that the ways in which Isaac is associated with animals throughout the text, throughout his story, all of his stories, but especially this one, and the ways in which he is disabled and is figured as a disabled character, both in his interpretive history and in the text, sort of allow the interpreters of the text to sort of construct what is an appropriate form of humanity. Isaac sort of is the patriarch of the nation of Israel. He's literally Israel's father, right? And so many scholars have argued that that Isaac is in many ways meant to stand in, is meant to be a sort of standing in for Israel in some way, that the people of Israel are meant to see themselves as in some way as Isaac, even though he's also being represented as this sort of inappropriately, animalized, inappropriately disabled figure. And so I guess what I will close on, and this isn't necessarily a conclusion so much as maybe something to think about, is just the ways in which these boundaries are kind of porous, the ways in which the boundaries between disabled and non-disabled are kind of porous, the ways in which the boundaries between animal and human are kind of porous, and the ways in which they inform one another. And so that's, anyway, again, this is a very truncated version of something that I'm studying in a lot more detail, but this is, these are the kinds of questions that I'm asking, is how do these ideas of animality and disability and race and gender and queerness and all these other things which come into play later in my thesis, inform what we think of as an appropriate human, as a normal human. And that I think is where I'm going to stop so that I don't just repeat myself again. So thank you, everyone. And I'm sorry that you couldn't see me. That probably would have made it easier to listen, but, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucas. And thank you also, especially for keeping a very close and strict control over the time. Thank you for this fascinating presentation. And now over to Elliot. Elliot?
Hello. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, we're good. Awesome. So now for something completely different, or perhaps actually not so different at all. Let's talk about monsters. So occasionally when I'm asked about my research, a kind of hesitation creeps over me. You know the feeling probably, that low frequency rumble that steals in, sinking into your bones, vibrating upwards from your toes, along your spine, tickling the hair on your arms. Something like the Jaws theme, actually, a kind of dread. And it's dreadful in two ways. The worry that my research will be dismissed, that it will not be taken seriously, coupled with the much worse prospect that my research will be taken seriously. The world is, after all, only a superficially serious place, and it is a place wherein demons dwell and humans fear to tread. Or my cat. Sorry, there may be cat interruptions. I hate to start with Latin, that perennial introductory favorite, but I'm going to start with Latin. What is a monster? The word monster comes from the Latin moneo monere, meaning to warn or portend, and the verb monstro monstrare, to show, to reveal. You'll recognize it from the word demonstrate, probably. Monsters can therefore be understood on one level as representations or symbols that reflect that which must be warned about, or that which might communicate some additional sort of meaning or warning to an audience, to those who are observing it, something external to the monster itself. Certainly, as former avid theater goers, currently probably couch potatoes at a guess, given the current pandemic situation, we're likely at least to be familiar with the use of monsters to frighten, and through frightening, through that sort of visceral reaction of the audience, to warn away from doing something, to sort of behaving in particular ways, to loving certain people. And this sort of pervades and has pervaded, obviously, Hollywood cinema, television, comics, movies, folklore, obviously for, to use, I'm sounding really undergrad, you know, for all of history. The explosion of popularity of the zombie in the early 2000s is a fine example, and one with contemporary resonance, given the continuing popularity of the television show The Walking Dead, or perhaps some of you have already checked out the Zack Snyder film that recently dropped on Netflix, Army of the Dead. I actually haven't, so please don't ask me about that one yet. As zombies shamble into our living rooms to terrify, they produce meaning. That is, they produce warning, not only of themselves. Few of us, after all, take seriously the threat of a zombie apocalypse, although notably there are some who do. But rather they simultaneously kind of serve as these ghoulish metaphors for real world perils that we might encounter, or those things which the societies and cultures in which we live deem to be perils, perhaps more precisely. At their most basic, zombies, as my example, as walking or shuffling corpses, can be read and have been read historically as frightening memento mori, that is, abject reminders of our own mortality and the transitory nature of our fleshy forms. Now, I opted not to do a sort of visual presentation along with this, but I wanted to point out that this is about where I would feature a slide of the classic 2014, 2014 is now classic, I guess, film Zombievers, just a couple with this very serious discussion of mortality, in which those bitten by the titular zombievers are transformed not only into zombies, but zombie beavers. At one point, there is a zombie beaver bear. It's marvelous, the height of contemporary cinema, and yes, very much worth celebrating, I think. So monsters generally are sort of producing meaning. That is, in the words of scholars, monster studies scholars Jeffrey Jerome Cohen and J. Jack Halberstam, they are what we call meaning machines. Zombies and other monsters have come not only to embody, describe, or perpetuate and inculcate notions of our own mortality, but broader social meanings and messages as well. So just as some examples in the ways in which the zombie specifically as my chosen example has done this recently. In 2012, some of you may be familiar with the work of scholar John Quiggin, who proposed the concept of what he called the zombie economy. That is, fantasies of capitalist utopia that lurch on in economic discourse, both popular and academic. He uses, for example, the sort of trickle-down economics, those sorts of things, that kind of lurch on long after they've outlived their actual use. So just as zombie bodies seem to continue on after their deaths, despite the lack of sort of functioning organs, functioning minds, so too these economic ideas continue to kind of exist and also to reproduce themselves. We might even use as an example, yet again, The Walking Dead, which reinforces a connection between zombification, mindless consumption, particularly capitalist consumption, and the exploitation of an underclass. And this is a connection, a symbolic meaning that's been given and read into the zombie, from Romero onwards, essentially, perhaps even earlier. I could make that argument, but I won't right now. That sort of zombies are this kind of stand-in for sort of consumption. Again, in the 2013 to 2014 BBC series In the Flesh, which I've spoken about before, zombies are oppressed minorities that stand in for a myriad of real-world marginalized groups, from queer people to disabled people, as well as religious minorities. This series doesn't really hold back in explicitly linking the production of monstrous others by a given culture with real-world atrocities, from its linkage of zombie protagonist Kieran Walker's identity as a gay man who has mental health struggles, with the medicalization of his zombie state, as well as his ostracization from the Northern English community in which he lives. So in the series, before Kieran dies and then, experiences his zombified state, his revivification, he is ostracized already by this community for being a gay man. And upon sort of reviving as a zombie, he experiences a very similar ostracization because of his zombiehood. It's drawing these very explicit connections here. And the same thing essentially happens with his sort of mental health issues. It's sort of the framing of the zombie body is one in the flesh of sort of the disabled body as sort of inherently other, as one that needs to be masked using prostheses or using different medications to kind of contain and control aberrant behaviors in sort of disabled populations. It extends also to sort of the portrayal of zombies as a population which ought to be physically segregated from the normate human population of the community. So for instance, there are certain places in which zombies are not allowed to go. In the local pub, there's special reserved seating for zombies that they have to sit in. They're not allowed to mingle with others. And the show in its final second season eventually sort of culminates with the creation of this government scheme called the Give Back Project, during which the zombies are voluntarily, but actually it's enforced, to sign up for this schema in which they can sort of work and perform menial labor tasks like building fences to keep other zombies out of the community in exchange for sort of points in order to be allowed to kind of live freely in human society again. And of course that freedom, quote unquote, never actually materializes. And there's some clear sort of parallels, obviously, there, I think, with contemporary and historical circumstances that the show is drawing attention to. In 2017's Meanwhile Elsewhere, an anthology of trans speculative fiction, Bridget Lang reimagined zombies as a vehicle through which to express their frustrations as a mixed race trans youth growing up in a world hostile to not only their desires, but also their needs and identity. And this is a particularly Canadian context. So Lang themselves actually grew up in Ontario and sort of experienced their kind of coming of age or coming of queerness, if you will, in an Ontario context. In their story, which is titled Delicate Bodies, Lang's protagonist is transformed into a zombie whose body is a source of horror and disdain for the men that she tries to date. When her Grindr date, and for those who don't know, Grindr is kind of a relationship app online and is used to sort of for hookups for sex as well as romance, more so sex, I think. And so she meets up with her Grindr date, a man named Sean, and Sean tells her, quote, "Oh, and I'd never fuck a zombie," end quote. Lang parallels the comment with Sean's observation that the main character, the zombie protagonist, Beryl, is trans. So earlier in the same paragraph even, Sean actually sort of notes like, "Oh, hey, you're a trans lady," and then follows that up with this zombie comment. This gets pretty brutal. So Sean attacks the protagonist, Beryl, following his comment. So he physically tries to kill her. And Beryl, the zombie, then sexually assaults and kills him in revenge, a series of events that then repeats throughout the story. The scene is graphic and disturbing. Lang's own rage embodied in the monster, she constructs in order to enact fictionalized violence upon her oppressors, a group identified in the text mostly with cis white men, specifically cis white gay men, actually. And so she's sort of interrogating, albeit perhaps in a very disturbing way, the sort of internal politics of the queer community and the way that the queer community can often ostracize within its own marginalized context as well. The specific use of the monster as a tool through which to produce meaning by and for marginalized people is a central area of interest for my work. So this is primarily the kind of stuff I look at, is when marginalized people are kind of looking at and creating work that engages with monstrosity and positions marginalized people themselves as monsters. Now, the history of the use of monsters to describe societal others is long and fraught, and I'm sure a lot of us are quite familiar with it already. From the depictions of Jews and Muslims as literal demons in service to Satan and Antichrist in the medieval and early modern Christian West, to the use of Frankensteinian imagery to describe the Nat Turner Rebellion of Virginia's Black slaves in 1831 America, to the symbolic shorthand of early 20th century Universal monster pictures that coded werewolves, vampires, and mad scientists, as well as other assorted creepy crawlies, as queer, racialized others, religious and as well as religious and political others, who threaten the status quo of white, straight, Christian America. Particularly for queer audiences of the Universal films, as well as pictures by Hammer Studios and RKO and assorted others, monster pictures were a central means by which those audiences could see themselves portrayed, albeit in a somewhat veiled way, often depending on sort of coded imagery, such as the really subtle things like the use of flowers in a scene can indicate queer identity for a character, for instance. And so this is one of the only ways in which to see these relationships portrayed on screen. Now, not all of these portrayals are entirely unsympathetic to their monsters. Out gay director James Whale, in his 1931 production of Frankenstein, but particularly in 1935's Bride of Frankenstein, uses the film to portray a procreative queer relationship through the characters of Dr. Pretorius and Henry Frankenstein. And notably in that film also, it's actually the desire for heterosexuality that causes all the problems. The creature's desire for a female mate is sort of what leads to, all of the violence that ensues and the disaster. And he also uses it, particularly in 1931's Frankenstein, as a critique of the lynching of Black men by white mobs under Jim Crow. Such messages were not lost on contemporary critics either, with one British commentator noting that the mob scene in which Frankenstein's creature is chased by angry villagers recalled, quote, a Georgia lynching. 1941's The Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr. Introduces the most consistently sympathetic of Universal's monster roster in the figure of Larry Talbot, who is coded as Jewish in the film. Yet for all that Talbot, Frankenstein's creature and their fellow monsters are often portrayed as sympathetic, emphasis in the later Universal offerings, those coming out in kind of the late 40s, around 1945, is on potential cure, so read assimilation in one way or another for its monster characters. Thus in 1945's House of Dracula, Talbot is finally cured of his werewolfery. That is, he's converted. If we're reading this character as Jewish, if we're reading him through a queer lens, we might say this is sort of like being subsumed into a kind of a heteronormative status, and is able to finally marry the beautiful Milica Morel. So his story ends with sort of becoming human and being allowed to sort of be a productive member and a procreative member of society. Monsters like Dracula, who cannot be cured or who refuse cure, must necessarily be killed and or expelled from upright Christian heteronormative society. Given the long history of the association between monster social and social others, it is perhaps no wonder, okay, I'll try to talk quicker, that contemporary media reimagines monstrous characters positively from the perspective of the very groups who were previously demonized using those same monster characters. Bridget Lang's Delicate Bodies is not the first monster story to view the figure of the monster as a source of vengeance or defense upon or against would-be assailants and oppressors. Udo Rosenberg's Tales of the Golem and Rabbi Lowe, in which Lowe creates a golem made of clay to help him defend against accusations of blood libel lodged against Prague's Jewish community by the priest Thaddeus, is one such example of what is a rich tradition of golem stories, positioning the monster as savior, though sometimes also turning notably on those who call it into being. Lang's story positions the zombie-human, read trans-cis, relationship as one that cannot be reconciled, save by the absorption of cis people by the trans monster. That is, only by being bitten and transformed or consumed, literally eaten, can cis humans and trans zombies create peace. Yet in Rosenberg, as in Helen Wecker's 2013 Golem novel, The Golem and the Genie, the monster becomes a tool for community healing, not to get self-helpy, acceptance, and in Wecker's case, assimilation into American society. In Wecker's novel, the golem protagonist is a Polish immigrant frightened by her own capacity for violence towards humans. That is, the golem's superhuman strength. Eventually, however, she comes to terms with her outsider status and happily becomes part of the melting pot of New York society. These two strains of contemporary monstrous representation conflict over the place of marginalized existence within a broader culture. One position is assimilationist, focused on rendering the monster safe. The other depends on a doubling down on the violent potential of the monster to use force to defend a community. Both approaches, however, mobilize the power of the other to represent marginalized figures as persons with social capital, that is, persons with power, to enact their own futures. For many of us, historically, human has been and is an impossible standard. Even in the mildest of these monster narratives, the authors and their monster protagonists typically reject the category of, of the human, I'll just finish this one sentence, as one that speaks to their own experience. So I'll just terminate there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elliot. Thank you. I know it's hard. We would love to hear more, but there is Sara waiting in the queue. So let's now turn it over to her.
Okay, thank you. I see my video is spotlighted. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me, and to the other presenters. Thank you to Jennifer and Dr. Nicolini. I feel very honored to have this opportunity to present my research to you. And also thank you to my professors who are here, Norma Joseph and Naftali Cohen. So, okay, I'm gonna do sort of a quasi PowerPoint because I just have a couple of slides. Okay, so hi, I'm Sara. I'm an MA student at Concordia University. I am studying Judaic Studies. Today I will discuss my MA thesis project entitled Friendship, Gender, and Jewishness, Interpersonal Connections Between Jewish Women in Montreal, supervised by Dr. Norma Joseph. As I begin my PhD studies this fall, I will be expanding on this MA research with additional groups of participants for my doctoral dissertation entitled Friendship as a Jewish Practice, Connecting Gender, Race, Age, and Queerness. My research engages ethnographic data from interviews with senior Jewish women in order to investigate the ways in which interpersonal relationships help people to reclaim or reconstitute their cultures and traditions while negotiating the multiple and complicated social positions they inhabit. This project began with the research for my BA honors thesis, which consisted of analysis of ethnographic data gathered through participant observation and individual recorded interviews with 5 Jewish women aged between 70 and 96 years old, employing intersectional feminist and queer theory in order to analyze the friendships between the women and their relationships to the Coming Center, a Jewish senior community center in Montreal, which all of them attend in various capacities. For my MA research, I expanded on this project, applying the same methodology with additional groups of participants. My MA research focuses on members from the Women's Learning Group at the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in Montreal, who are also Jewish women and seniors. This project employs a critical lens regarding interactions of Jewishness and gender. How might age and other social locations impact these interactions? Some of the participants are immigrants. How does this experience interact with gender and Jewishness? What is meant by categories such as woman and Jewish? This research asks, what does Jewish identity mean to people who are traditionally excluded from powerful institutions of Judaism, and how are interpersonal relationships and thus intersubjectivity significant to the sense of meaning? The nuclear family structure holds great significance in Western societies surrounding the prescribed gender and cultural religious roles of Jewish women. My research emphasizes the friendships formed between Jewish women outside of the family structure in order to understand how interpersonal relationships, which are independent from familial roles, such as wife and mother, help women to inform and construct a sense of autonomous Jewish identity. My prior interviews indicate that through interpersonal relationships, women have the ability to reciprocally empower each other to help imbue each other with a sense of autonomy and significance. The interviews for my BA research mainly took place during the summer of 2019. As I began my MA degree in the fall of that year, my supervisor connected me with the Women's Learning Group, which was beginning its 21st series. I attended the series, which consisted of 6 sessions. The founder of the group, Gladys, welcomed me into the group. I met with her for an interview at her home in December of 2019. I plan to conduct further interviews with the members of the Women's Learning Group in the spring and summer of 2020, after the 22nd series of their program had wrapped up. And I'll just show you here we go. This was the program for the 22nd series as it was meant to take place. So you can get a sense of what the Women's Learning Group consists of, and you can see at the bottom the itinerary. They have Hebrew classes, then they have a speaker, they have lunch together, and then they have Israeli dance. But in fact, this program did not end up taking place as it was planned. In mid-March of 2020, Concordia announced it would be closing its campuses due to the pandemic. Daily life changed rapidly as lockdown began and previously bustling streets were quiet and empty. The first session of the Spring Women's Learning Group series had been scheduled to take place on April 22nd at the synagogue. On March 27th, I received an email from Gladys announcing that the Women's Learning Group would go online. They would use Zoom. I attended the Zoom sessions, and in June of 2020, after the online Women's Learning Group series had wrapped up, I began interviewing members of the group either through Zoom or over the telephone, starting with Gladys. During the summer of 2020, I interviewed 12 members of the group. All of them are Jewish women. Most of them immigrated to Canada from Middle Eastern countries, and almost all of them are seniors. For the purposes of this presentation, I will focus on discussing my interviews with Gladys before and after the pandemic began. Gladys grew up in Baghdad and was forced to leave with her family in 1951 when she was 18 years old, after which they lived in Israel. She lived in Israel for 18 years and her parents both passed away there. She also met her husband and had children while living in Israel, though her husband was from Baghdad as well. She then moved to Canada with her husband because they were hoping for more economic opportunities. When I asked her what brought her to Montreal, she said it was due to economic difficulties that they left Israel and her husband wanted to try Canada. She also pointed out that relating to the economic difficulties was the fact that their property had been confiscated when they left Baghdad. Having lived in Israel for many years, married and had kids there, she would have to start over again in Canada. Write down again, she emphasized as she told me this story. Gladys explained that she found relief in the synagogue in Montreal when she was grieving for her mother. She found friendship and connection there. A few years later, when she was grieving for her husband, the idea for a ladies' bat mitzvah came about with Rabbi Joseph and Norma and Rabbi Orenstein in order for Gladys to be surrounded by friends and loved ones and feel much better. And now one more slide. So this is the photo from the ladies' bat mitzvah. You can see this is Gladys right here. So that you can see it was a very joyous occasion. Okay. After the ladies' bat mitzvah, the group did not want to stop, and so the women's learning group formed. In her introduction to women as ritual experts, Susan Starr-Sarad writes that the women described here are pious Jews. Indeed, religion is the focus of their lives, yet their religious lives seem to have little in common with what most of us mean when we talk about Judaism. Gladys stated that the group, quote, started to learn Judaism, and this is what we did at the beginning. And many of them started to come to the synagogue on Shabbat after we started the learning group, unquote. She explained that the material they focus on is always connected to Judaism. Similarly to Sarad's assertion that Jewish religion is the focus of the lives of her research participants, yet those lives seem to have little in common with what is normatively meant by Judaism, the women's learning group may not resonate with what practicing Judaism typically means, but for these women, perhaps there is something Jewish about practicing friendship. Perhaps Judaism is an avenue through which to form and maintain friendships. As Gladys points out that many of the women started to come to the synagogue on Shabbat after joining the learning group, which indicates that it was the friendships which drew them to traditional Jewish services in an Orthodox synagogue, those services in some way serving as an extension of the social communal space the women had built for themselves, where they are the focus, as opposed to their limited role in services. Regarding men joining in on the learning group, Gladys stated, quote, my concern, I am afraid that men start to ask too many questions because men have tendency more to ask and to speak, and I want the women to do that. It's their program, unquote. Judith Plaskow describes a complicated balancing act, the efforts of striving for modes of Jewish expression which negotiate between contemporary ethical sensibilities and a sense of loyalty to tradition. Such a balance is important to strike, particularly for Jews who find themselves negotiating among multiple communities. The balancing act is evident in the way that Gladys navigates loyalty to the synagogue and male rabbis with maintaining the learning group for the women as, quote, their program. This group of women are Jews who negotiate multiple communities. As they are Jews, women, many of them are immigrants from Middle Eastern countries, particularly Iraq, and they are also seniors. They support each other through experiences relating to their age and stage of life. As Gladys explained, that a few of us this year are very sick and they are embraced by us. They take every opportunity to come with us, wherever we are. If we are at Women's Learning Group or wherever we are, we see them with us, even though they're not going out from home, but when we get together, they make sure to come with us and join. And we have quite a few of us who have lost her husband, and they come to us. They feel a refuge with us. We are very happy together, unquote. These women have formed strong connections and networks of support, which exist outside of their family lives. Gladys frequently mentions her children and grandchildren as well, who are important parts of her life, but beyond her family life and her familial roles, She also has tight-knit bonds with the women in her friend group, for whom she is not mom or grandma, she is Gladys. Hasiya Diner and Beryl Benderly state that after World War II, many Jewish families counted on not only a breadwinning husband, but also a wife who helped out. The Jewish community also needed women who helped build the institutions of middle-class Jewry. Referring to the United States in the first half of the 20th century, Diner and Benderly assert that as prominent as sisterhoods became in the lives of synagogue women, women without synagogue ties also worked to aid the Jewish community. Council, Hadassah, and several newer organizations channeled their charitable impulses into activities that women controlled. As Gladys had explained that many women began attending services at the synagogue subsequent to connecting with the Women's Learning Group, Diner and Benderly's assertion similarly indicates that Jewish women's groups and charitable efforts can attract women who are not affiliated with the synagogue. There seems then to be some sense of community or connection among women's groups which is distinct from the connections formed through general synagogue affairs, which draws women in who may not be interested in attending regular synagogue events and services. Diner and Benderly explained that many women less comfortable with synagogue life found similar vehicles for Jewish identity in organizations like Council and Hadassah, because these groups engaged seriously in political, cultural, and civic concerns. Their members could view themselves as intelligent, active citizens, not mere extensions of their husbands and children. Therefore, a lineage can be established through which women's groups and organizations for Jewish women have historically been a means through which to give back and enact compassionate values, and also as a means through which to form a sense of identity outside of the family structure. Gladys stated that, quote, "It's day and night work. It's my aim to make my group happy and my speakers happy and the people who work hard for us in the synagogue happy. I have to show appreciation to everybody. That's the only way I can thank them." It is clear through this statement how Gladys aims to contribute and give back to her community, to make others happy, to help. She gives credit frequently to everyone who has helped her and everyone who supports her program. But she also takes ownership over her work and her accomplishments. She is proud of what she has done. Discussing the beginning of the formation of the group, Gladys stated that, "We were friends, we like each other. We were a kind of small group. We used to have breakfast together. And when I announced, 25 came. They say when I invite people, they come. I can attract people. They know when I tell them something, it's good for them." Unquote. Gladys is confident in her strength as the leader of this group, the convener of this little community of women. As Diner and Benderly explain, members of Jewish women's groups could view themselves as intelligent and active, not mere extensions of their husbands and children. The Women's Learning Group is a space where the women are the focus, the driving force. The Women's Learning Group at its core is a network of friendships, and it is demonstrative of the creative power, love, and perseverance women's friendships can involve. It has now been 11 years since the ladies' bat mitzvah, which would evolve into the Women's Learning Group. The group has persisted through countless changes and challenges in their personal lives, as well as in their community and the world more broadly. Not only has the group persisted, it has thrived, with significantly more members now than it had back at the beginning in 2009. With the new and frightening challenge of COVID-19 facing them, Gladys and her group continued to persevere. She explained that when she realized she would need to move the program onto Zoom, quote, "It wasn't easy, especially as much as I am working on the computer. I am not a teenager who can do everything very easily. I needed a lot of information," unquote. Drawing on the help and support of each other and their respective children and grandchildren in order to learn how to access Zoom, the Women's Learning Group successfully took place online for its 22nd series in the spring of 2020. The 24th series of the Women's Learning Group also took place online recently during the spring of 2021, and the 23rd series took place during the fall of 2020 over Zoom as well. This demonstrates how the group will not only make the effort to join the online sessions, but that their willingness to make that effort can endure over an entire year. Gladys explained that upon first hearing that the series would need to take place over Zoom, the members responded, "No, we hope not, because we want to be together." Gladys added that when I told them after Passover, they were happy. They already knew how to use Zoom because they learned for their seders. Regarding the transition online, Gladys said, quote, the program was already made and I changed it to accommodate the reality, unquote. This group of women wants to be together and they persevere. They accommodate the unexpected realities of life, including COVID-19, in order to stay together. As Sara phrases it, the women are the ones with the power to make or create, not simply to participate. These women, led tirelessly and devotedly by Gladys, have fashioned their own Jewish community, their own Jewish space, through a foundation of friendship. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sara. Fascinating chapter and a fascinating story. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions also to you. And now, last but certainly not least, the floor is yours. Issam, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Professor Chaba, for having me here today. Actually, my project is more pure politics and international law, a little bit far from religions and culture, but I will be touching this part in my work. Anyway, as you said in your introduction, my major field is Canadian as Indigenous studies and Middle Eastern politics. So my work is about self-determination and a comparative study between stateless Palestinians and Indigenous peoples of Canada. And the unique of this study, let me share with you my my slides. So I'm working in comparative study between these two groups and in their claims for the right of self-determination. And you might ask why I'm doing this comparative study. Actually, I'm doing this study because there are several common denominators between both groups. Both of them have an international recognition for the right of self-determination. And they claim, or they demand the right of self-determination. In both cases, the core conflict is over the land and natural resources, or I mean sovereignty over these both elements. And one of the common denominators between these both groups are none of them were able to achieve the right of self-determination. Like, as I said, both of them are entitled for this right of self-determination. The major difference between these two groups, one of them is considered stateless under occupation. The second one is the Indigenous people are part of the existing state, but to be honest, the Indigenous, for a long time, they were never being treated as a citizen, and they were treated as a ward of the state until just 1960. They granted them the right to vote, and they tried to accommodate them with the Canadian culture after the assimilation policies failed to achieve its goal, which is to finish the identity of these people. About self-determination, and let's now start a little bit about the international law. So we might ask, what do you mean by self-determination? And this concept came from where? When we have this concept? Actually, this concept started to appear legally at the early of 19th century during the First World War, and it was brought by the American President Woodrow Wilson, who presented this concept and gained the international recognition for the self-determination in his 14 points during the negotiation of Peace of Versailles and to the end of the First World War. And with the establishment of the League of Nations, they enshrined these principles under their covenants, and they use it to apply this legal system or this legal framework over the colonies that were part of the Ottoman Empire and some of the European states that were defeated in this war. We'll speak about Germany and Italy in most particular, and to give the the legal coverage for the dominant of the British and the French over these colonies. They want a legal coverage to control these colonies. So they shrink this in Article 22 of the League of Nations, and they call this the advanced nation to act as a mandatory over specific colonies and territories which were then incapable of self-rule. So they placed, like in Middle East, they placed Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq under the mandate between the French and the British to make them qualified for the right to exercise their right for self-determination. In the Second World War, actually, again, this concept was enshrined in the Covenant of the United Nations. And we have the decision, which is the most important decision, where it came from actually the Article number 1 and Article 55 and the Resolution 1514 in 1960, and they call it Declaration Granting of Independence to colonial countries and peoples, and was passed by the United Nations General Assembly. So we have to make difference between United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council. They have different legal terms. I will explain this later in my study, which is one of the deficiency in this concept. There's no legal binding for this concept. However, so they needed this legal concepts. As we know, after the Second World War, British and the French were unable to keep control over 70 countries. They want to find a legal clause to grant these countries the independence. So they use this system, or the right of self-determination, to grant these countries the independence. And now we come to a core point. What do we mean by right of self-determination? For this resolution 1960, for them is the right, it's like all people have the right to self-determination, and by virtue of that right freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic and social cultural development. This is what they think about it, but there's no clear definition for this right. So I can go for just other legal scholars like Collins. He said for him, the right of self-determination as a desire of people who are oppressed to regain control over their destiny. Other person like Tamir, he's a Jewish scholar, he said self-determination he perceived as the right of you to preserve their cultural and nation distinctions. So there's no clear legal definition for this right of self-determination. What is the component of this self-determination? This self-determination has two components: self-sufficiency and self-government. So if you want to be able to fulfill the right of self-determination, you should have control. You should have self-government over specific lands and achieve economic development. If you want to achieve the economic development, you need a control over your lands, which is they are connected with each other. Okay, watch my time. Now go for fourth group. As I said, they have recognition for the right of self-determination. Indigenous people of Canada, they have the United Nations Declaration of the right of the right of indigenous people. UNDRIP, they give him the right for self-determination. This at the beginning was rejected by Canada, but they ended Canada to ratify this this right. For the Palestinians, they have many resolutions to recognize their right for self-determination. Was the most prominent one was 1974 Resolution 3236 that recognized the Palestinian people as entitled to self-determination according to the Charter of the United Nations. So my study is going to do the following issues. We're going to study what are the factors, international and legal factors, that hinders or facilitate the achievement of this self-determination. And in which manner we should achieve self-determination. Palestinians, they're asking, we need independence. Is this feasible? Indigenous people, they are a minority in the country, and under a legal framework for this self-determination, self-determination doesn't allow minority to separate from their home country. So separation does not exist. So in which framework they should implement it? Is it just self-government, as now Canada is doing, like a comprehensive land settlement with these people and grant them very limited self-government, and then gonna study their experience in self-government and economic development? Palestinians like have experience as under Palestinian Authority, and indigenous people, they have several self-government agreement with Canada. The question of the study, how each group views this self-determination, the obstacle to achieving self-determinations, and factors influence the implementations of self-determination for Palestinians and indigenous people of Canada. Now, I will not take far since I have just 5 minutes. Let me speak very fast about the variables. So, as I said, the control is over natural resources and land. Indigenous people have land title, confirmed land title, over 50% of this country, which is, you speak about half of Canada, the indigenous have a land title. And this is the core conflict. They are negotiating, a long process negotiating, sometimes take for 30 or 40 years to reach a settlement with just one group of the indigenous. Let me make it clear, indigenous peoples are several nations, not one nation. They are living across the country. So this makes their mission is really complicated, since the government deal with them separate nation. They never deal with them in one package. Palestinians, the same problem. They have West Bank and Gaza recognized as under occupation. There are several resolutions to say that. For the Israelis, West Bank in most particular is a national security for the security of the Israel, control over these lands. If you look to the map of the Israel, you understand how the situation. If we remove West Bank, can we just narrow line between West Bank and the Mediterranean and make it a security conflict for the Israel, and that's what they say. Economic factors, indigenous people, they suffer from catastrophic economic situations, and this makes them weak in the negotiation with the government. Indigenous for the Palestinians, they are, I can do it in one word, that the economy of Palestinians and the Israelis close to be one. So the Palestinian is dependence in the Israelis economy. The gross domestic product per capita in Israel is 44,000. In Palestine is 6,000. There's a big gap, despite the fact they have the close to be a single market. Unique identity is clear. Palestinian is different from the Jewish. In the indigenous people is the same. These people have their distinct identity, and they want a recognition from the government and regain the control over their groups, and regain this control and remove, transfer this power from the federal to indigenous. So what I mean that if you are indigenous people living in Montreal, you can't claim that you are indigenous. You can't say I'm indigenous, but here I'm speaking about legal status. Legal status, that means you have a recognized legal status from the government, and the government who decide legal who is an indigenous, who is not an indigenous. So even if the indigenous said for you are indigenous, that means nothing until you get the recognition from the government. The last 2 points, security dilemma. One of them, as I said, the control over West Bank is security issue for the Israel, and for the Canada, half the country under indigenous title, and we hear that every time the government want to make like oil pipelines, the indigenous stand and hinder this project, and the government started to look at this like a security issue. Final point, limitation in the concepts. I will close this by explaining what I mean by limitation in the right of self-determination. So the self-determination is, as I said before, there's no clear definition for this right. So the United Nations doesn't have a clear definition. What do you mean by right of self-determination? And the second point, this is recognized by the General Assembly, which is mean there's no legal forces to implement of the right of self-determination. It's not a Security Council who has a decision is binding for the members. United Nations General Assembly, the decision is not binding for its members. It's not binding. This one. The third one is this right grant the supremacy of the land integrity and sovereignty over of the right of self-determination. Minority legally are not entitled for getting separated from their home countries, but still political expediency, since there's no legal definitions, since there's no legal binding for this, still the superpowers can manipulate the system, and we have countries like Kosovo, East Timor, they were able to get their independence despite the fact they are a minority, they were minority within their home countries. So there's no clear framework how to achieve right self-determination. This leads me to another one, like which I close my presentation. If we want to implement the right of self-determination, especially for minority, how are we going to grant them the right of self-determination? Is it self-government? Is it independence? Or as I said here in Canada, is it enough just to grant the indigenous people the control over their lands and their identity is enough to tell them, oh, now you achieve your right of self-determination? So this is the challenges in the achieving of the right of self-determination for both groups. Now, for the Palestinians, as I said, I close with this point, like it's getting more now, is more difficult. In 1967, it was, oh, given this granting the independence, it's fine. Now, 2021, with around 1 million of Jewish settlers living in West Bank, how gonna do this? How gonna make the independence? Is it now we have more projects like one-state solutions, local self-governments, independence, local self-governments, and annex the West Bank with Jordan. So there's everyone now still make more confused, even though they still speak about two-state solutions. But when they come to look in the ground, they found it more difficult or impossible to be implemented. And thank you so much. I close my presentation now with this. Okay.
Thank you very much, Issam.
Okay.
Another fascinating presentation. And before opening up the floor to the Q&A, I just want to say how thrilled I certainly am, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all the professors and other students at the Institute as well, to say that just such a rich wealth of knowledge that the 4 award recipients, Lucas, Elliot, Sara, and Issam, have shared with us today. So we wish each and every one of you best of luck, perseverance, and much success in your continued. If anybody has a question that he or she would like to put to the presenters, we are a small intimate group. You can choose to either send them in the chat or just raise your virtual hand, and between Jennifer and I, we will be sure to find you and call upon you. So any questions or comments? I'm looking in the chat. We have a very nice comment from Professor El-Hawari, who is thanking all the presenters for their great job. Any questions and comments? Okay, while you are I think we have, let me just see, Professor Cohn. Great job, everyone. Thanks for your interesting presentations. Thank you very much. So while you're gathering your thoughts and ideas, I would like to maybe tease you, the presenters that is, with the first question. And Lucas, if you're still there, I think my first question is to you. I just don't see you. I hope you're still there. Lucas,
I'm still here.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Lucas, I found your presentation as well as your work. I have read a little bit about. Truly fascinating. because it challenges my own conventional understanding of an important concept in Judaism, and that is separation. Separation is so important in normative Jewish practice, the separation between the weekday and the holiday or Shabbat, the separation between the Jew and the non-Jew. And certainly Judaism, the separation of what's appropriate to eat, what's not appropriate to eat, it's just throughout. You're pointing to the porousness of what I always understood to be much clearer as stricter boundaries. So help me out.
Mm-hmm.
Help me out. Are the boundaries really not as porous as I perhaps understood them always to be in normative Judaism? Whatever my understanding of normative Judaism may have been different. But in any event, I think you're pushing the boundary by making it more porous. And I think that's fascinating. So just help me out. I would be very, very interested in hear your reflections on it.
Sure. So I guess the sort of main thing that I think about when I think about these kinds of boundaries, and you're very right, you know, Judaism in many ways is a tradition that is very, very heavily focused on boundaries between what you are and aren't allowed to eat, or who you are and aren't allowed to associate with in various capacities. You know, certain types of day, certain times of day, and certain days, and certain times of year, and et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting to me because all of those boundaries really are constructed boundaries, right? And the maintenance of those boundaries is what's really, really important sort of throughout the tradition. It's, you know, it's important to observe all of these various boundaries, you know, in order to sort of remain a sort of full participating member of, you know, one's community, right? And not, we see, and my work is primarily on biblical literature and everything, and I don't so much study, you know, modern Jews and their sort of particular practices, but at least in the texts that I study, you know, we see people who fail to maintain those boundaries being sort of ostracized from their communities and that sort of thing. People who fail to, you know, to respect boundaries of intermarriage and respect food-related boundaries and holiday-related boundaries being removed from their communities, at least temporarily sometimes. And so why I think it's important to sort of identify the porosity of some of those boundaries is because we really are trying to impose order on a sort of chaotic, you know, universe of people who are all very different and people who are all doing different things. And specifically, of course, I'm interested in the boundaries that are being put around certain types of bodies and the behaviors that bodies have. And I think that those kinds of boundaries, you know, exist both to include and to exclude people in different capacities, right? So they exist to create the boundaries of what is, you know, Jewish identity, and you can't see me doing air quotes, but doing the boundaries of what is Jewish identity, the boundaries of what is, you know, Israelite identity, are sort of formed by these constructions of appropriate and inappropriate diet, appropriate and inappropriate humanity, and appropriate and inappropriate behavior, you know, sort of at certain times of year or day or what have you. So I think I've lost the thread of answering what you're saying, but yeah, for me, the insistence on those boundaries, it is very important and it is very much present in the tradition because there's this sort of recognition that those categories aren't necessarily inherent. And I think that the insistence on those boundaries is itself a recognition that the categories that we're imposing are imposed categories and that they're not, you know, inherently existent. And so it's important that they be affirmed for that reason.
Thank you very much, Lucas. Thank you.
Thanks. That was a really good question also.
Thank you. Jennifer, could you bring us back to a more common view? Because I can only see Lucas's dark screen. There are two virtual hands coming up. I think one of them is Professor Cohn. The other one I don't see. Jennifer, if you're there, can you?
I am here. I have asked Professor Cohn to unmute himself so he can ask his question.
Wonderful.
There we go.
My turn. Thank you again to everybody for these really interesting presentations, informative, little taste of your work. I have different questions I could ask everyone, but I will focus, I'll start with or pick one. Sara, I was thinking about one point you made, raised intriguing question to me, which is that friendship could be Jewish friendship, I guess. But obviously friendship is not specifically Jewish necessarily. So one of the points you made is that it was done in a Jewish context, through a synagogue. But are there other ways? But I guess part of the point is that friendship could be specifically Jewish friendship. So I was wondering if you could speak more about what made these friendships Jewish friendship, what's added by the Jewish context, just to elaborate on that a bit. Thank you.
Great. Well, okay. Thank you for your question. I think I unmuted at the same time as you unmuted me. Thank you for your question. Yes, I think it's sort of, it's interesting you phrasing it as Jewish friendship. I think that's sort of an interesting idea as well. I am thinking of it kind of as friendship as a means through which to connect to a sense of Jewishness or Jewish identity, or perhaps Judaism, sort of an avenue, because that was one of the things that Gladys said to me. She said, it started with Judaism. It was about learning more about Judaism. It started with the ladies' bat mitzvah, which is this very, I think, interesting milestone, which sort of speaks to this intersection of gender and age and Jewishness, because it's these women who are of a certain generation who did not have a bat mitzvah when they were young, and now they're at a certain age that they feel some kind of desire to have this rite of passage at a time when it's not typically done. So just as an example sort of the Jewishness of how these friendships function. But then also I think, there's sort of that origin story of the ladies' bat mitzvah, which I think is like a really good example of how Judaism and Jewishness and their Jewish identities play into their connections. But then there's also, of course, the women's learning group itself and the components of that program, which is frequently focused on speakers who discuss various Jewish topics, not exclusively, but definitely with an emphasis on Jewish topics. And so I think that's what's very interesting, I think, about this, is that there's an interplay. I think it's not just that they're connecting with their Jewishness, which I think is a piece of it that I like to analyze, but it's the interplay of how they're connecting with their Jewishness through their friends, also through this specific time in their lives when their family roles may be evolving and shifting. And so it's really those different parts of the equation that come together. And also the gender, of course, the fact that they are women and they are, as I mentioned, they attend an Orthodox synagogue. They may not have had the same kind of opportunities to engage with traditional Judaism that a man might have had. So this women's learning group gives them this space to practice friendship as well as Judaism, and maybe practice friendship through Judaism, and maybe practice Judaism through friendship. And it's really sort of this perfect storm, I think, of these various sort of identities and stages in their lives that they're each experiencing.
Thank you, Sarah. I think the next virtual hand up was Elliot and then Dr. Saleh. And if it was in the reverse order, I apologize. Elliot?
Yeah.
And then Dr.
Awesome. I actually had two questions, but one for Sarah and one for Sam, and I'll ask Sam first, I guess. So I've been seeing a lot lately just online about activism, mutually beneficial activism and activist projects between, say, something like BLM, Black Lives Matter, and Palestinian activists. And so thinking about it in terms of like Canadian indigeneity and that sort of thing, I'm kind of curious if you could say something a bit more maybe about these kinds of projects, what they look like in a Canadian space in terms of the potential for kind of different activist groups to come together. And yeah, if you know anything about that, or if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about that. Less of a question and more of a kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I heard about these activities recently, Palestinian Life Matter, and we have before that like BDS movements, which is caused to boycott the Israeli army or Israeli company that support the settlements, most particularly in West Bank. And about this activist is just, I think the main goal is to raise the awareness about Israel's occupation to the West Bank and Gaza, and about indigeneity. It's like a big topic, and it's one of the main reason that I choose this project. Like here in Canada, it's undisputable that the indigenous people of Canada, they are the indigenous people of this country. So no one have a conflict. In the Palestinian side and the Israelis, we Palestinians think that we are the indigenous, and the Israelis think that the indigenous, and it's getting more complicated. So if we want to take it from this point, it's going to getting more and more complicated issue, but I do prefer to focus in more legal terms. Now, when my presentation, I said that the situation is getting more and more difficult. Now, in the Israelis legal scenes, everything now shift towards the right. In the Palestinian side, shift toward rights. So there's no common ground between both peoples. The last war yesterday, I was speaking with my professor, Sally. I told him, this is the first war that we had between both groups. It's not a war between a colonized and a colonizer. It's the war of Benjamin Netanyahu. This man, he want to just take this war to stay in power. Otherwise, he's going to go to jail. And this is not our point of view as a Palestinian. It's the point of view even as Israelis. They said, this man, where is he taking us? He's just going to stay as a prime minister and just take this war immediately after he lost the opportunity to form the government, and now he shifted to the opposition leader, Lapid, and he saw they might Lapid form this government with a support of a Palestinians party in Israel to give the grant him the life. And he said, okay, let's go to the war. And he started from Al-Aqsa Mosque and started to evict people in Jerusalem just to push for this war. Believe me, he doesn't care about war. He want to just stay as a prime minister. If he formed the government within a week or within 2 weeks, believe me, they will not see anything within 2 or 3 years. Can have very long ceasefires. He doesn't care. He want to just stay as a prime minister. This is the first war. I find it just to serve the agenda of one person. Now, go back about the situation. When I say that people are raising more, and we have to start to see more international awareness about this issue, because the situation is getting more complicated. In the past, was clear, two-state solution based on Oslo Agreement 1994, and that's it. After 25 years of these Oslo agreements, now we had over 1 million of Israeli settlers in West Bank. How now going to save this situation? It's getting more complicated. Israel has 2 million Palestinians, and they are Palestinians, but they are Israeli citizens. So more now we hear Palestinians, some left Palestinians and some left Israelis in political scenes. They said, let's make it one-state solutions. Both right, they said, no, we don't want both one-state solution. Legal term, we are under occupations. The enforcements, no one want to enforce this right, because there's no mechanism to enforce this right of self-determination. for the indigenous here in Canada, as it's the same for the Palestinians. So that's what I say. The situation is getting more complicated, and unfortunately, it's going to getting more even complicated in the future, unless we reach to a political settlements, and will not be able to do it without a neutral third party who can impose this settlement. And this, what I can say, I'm not really optimistic in the future until we get rid from this man. He just want to stay as a prime minister. Hopefully, we're gonna have someone. Hopefully, we're gonna have one in the Palestinian side who's sorry, in the Israeli side. Is really willing to bring the negotiation in the table, not just putting in the freezer to serve his agenda. And if you know that Benjamin Netanyahu, the whole coalition of his government is with the right parties. There's nothing in their agendas, something called Palestinian state, which is getting more complicated situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Issam. The next hand is by Dr. Saleh.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me as well here. It's very interesting. My question is really for Issam. And full disclosure, I am Issam's thesis supervisor. I'm going to ask you a question, Issam, that we've already discussed. I probably already know the answer, but I think in this small but public forum, I think it's important that you try to elaborate a little more. My question is, what do you expect really to find or to accomplish with this comparison between Indigenous peoples in Canada and Palestinians? Because I mean, some people could argue or would argue against your comparison that these are very different situations. Maybe there is the hook of self-determination, but they're very, in terms of the history, in terms of even the dynamics, the political, socioeconomic dynamics within those societies, it's very different. So why? And some people might even be perhaps insulted that you would compare, for example, the both, and saying that there's no colonialism in Israel, for example, as opposed to where I think there's a history that could be made, or a case that could be made, certainly, that there is indeed a colonialist history, or at least a conventional colonial history in Canada. So please elaborate for us what you think you can accomplish, both theoretically and empirically, by comparing what could be, and it's not, you don't see this comparison very often, certainly in comparative politics, what you think you can accomplish by comparing these, what could be seemingly, at least for some people, very different cases.
As I said, that two factors that pushed me to speak about this, or to take the risk of writing this dissertation about these two groups, as I said, you said one of them Indigenous here in Canada, and they are part of the state, and the other one under the occupation, they are Palestinians. Let's start from this point. Elliot spoke a little bit before 5 minutes about indigeneity. Mm-hmm. So let's take from this. The core problem here in Canada, these indigenous people are the indigenous, and the most core problem why they until now are unable to achieve their right for self-determination is lands. So these people have the control or the land title over 50% of this country, and the Canada will not give him the opportunity to take control over 50% of these lands with natural resources. This means these people are gonna control everything in this country. So this is very difficult situation, make them very hard, make their pursuit for self-determination is really difficult. The third point for indigenous people, the government need a solution to deal with over 600 of reserves in this country, and find the solutions for the Indian Act and make these people as any Canadian citizen. Meanwhile, they said, no, we are an indigenous, we need special status, which is the same like Quebec. We are a French, we need special status in the Constitution. But with difference, these people, we have the land title. Now let's take it toward the Palestinian side. You says that there are no colonial history. So what do you call the?
I don't say that. As some people, I'm saying that some people might argue that. Yeah.
No. Just one makes it. In Canada side, I find it. No one speak about colonization from the Canadian government or the indigenous people. They thought majority of the population in the world look to indigenous as a Canadian citizen, not a colonized people. Meanwhile, the indigenous people here look to themselves as a colonized people. So it's difficult. In Palestine, everyone in the world knows that we are under colonization. So let's ignore 1948, the establishment of Israel. Let's take it from 1967. So we are speaking about 53 years we are under colonization. We are under international law stateless, but we consider themselves as indigenous people of this country. And Israel said, no, we are the indigenous. So that's why I said it's more complicated topic to speak about indigeneity. So let's focus, let's put this conflict, because if we speak about indigeneity, the Jew gonna bring their Bible, to say, oh, the indigenous, and the Palestinians they're gonna bring their Quran, and gonna speak about their long existence in this country, and the Jews, they will never exist once for in the last 3,000 years. So this is why I didn't focus a lot about this issue, and I choose the concept of self-determination from the legal term. Now let's go for the Palestinians. Why these people, they are unable to achieve the right of self-determination? For the Israel, there are three main points. One is like religious point, that West Bank is the most religious part in their states. Let's put it aside. There are two more important things, which is one, security and lands. So for them in the West Bank is considered a national security for the Israel, control of this land to protect their safety. Second part is like these lands important for their natural resources, water, and extended for their country, as you said. So what I think is like we're gonna bring from this study that both of them, indigenous and Palestinians, are looking for the right of self-determination. Indigenous until now find it difficult how they want to achieve this right of self-determination. Is it self-government or control over their lands and their identity? And separation is not exist in the table with the majority of them. Palestinians, separation is the first solution, and getting, as I said, more complicated since we have over 1 million of Jewish settlers in West Bank. And what I want to achieve, like, to focus in the answer main question for me, why these are unable to achieve the right of self-determination, send me back to the lands. Indigenous have control over 50% of the land. Palestinians, their land is strategic for the Israel, and the Israel, they were not willing to get to make these lands out of their control. And this is going to make dangerous for them to say, oh, we're going to grant West Bank a separation, and we're going to have the following day another Gaza, pulling our rockets in Tel Aviv, which is, and West Bank, far from Tel Aviv, is less than 5 kilometers. So just closing the border. So getting more complicated. So I ended that both groups, their cases is getting very complicated, and I believe me, if you I think that the Canadian government, they have no vision how we can solve this problem, and the Palestinians and the Israelis, I'm sure that both government looking for cases. What is the solution? Let's make it a status quo. We don't have any solution. No one is going to offer any solution. The Palestinians, we need a independence, but how can I implement this? The Israelis, we don't give the Palestinians the independence because for security reasons, but how can I deal with these people? We don't know. So let's keep it the status quo. This is unfortunately in both cases, indigenous and Palestinians, the status quo became the ideal options in both cases. And I ended this like Canada has colonial history with indigenous people, and in Israel Israel has a colonial history in West Bank and Gaza, and we have both of these groups have international recognition. But tell me, where's the superpowers? They are really not intended to solve that situation in both cases, as they did like in East Timor, Kosovo, and they got solution independence. And I ended my intervention with this question for everyone here.
Yeah. Okay.
How do you view the solution for the Palestinians and indigenous Palestinian and Israeli conflict? How do you think how we can solve this problem? One state solutions, two state solutions. What do you think is the best? I'm sure you will have different questions with different reasons to say this is what I think and this is my reasons. So I said it's getting more and more complicated.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Issam. This is really a very complex issue, as you said, and with lots of proposals on the table now and historically. And we could spend really a very, very long time debating and thinking about this. And I hope that we can do that. I really will be monitoring, if I may, closely your progress. I'm fascinated by this. Obviously, we are at the same department. And if time permits, maybe we can exchange views. Time doesn't allow me to engage now because obviously we are already pushing beyond the time that we expected to devote to this session. But I really am looking forward to more engagement and either here or at the department or perhaps at both forums. There is much to say. It's really a very complex problem, a complex political and historical issue.
I'm more than happy to share that with you in the future. And if you're willing, you can maybe within my committee, I will be more than happy to have it you in my committee since I am Professor Sari's the course supervisor. I'm still having another 2 supervisors. Anyway, I'm going to see you in my comprehensive exams. Don't worry, I'll contact you soon.
With pleasure, Issam. So I don't see any other virtual hands, which tempts me to bring this event to a conclusion. But since I have still control over the agenda, I am not going to resist, and I will maybe fire a last salvo of questions or comments at the award recipients. And if you find my questions way outlandish and irrelevant, just say so and don't engage. But I have 2 sets of questions. Really, one is a question to 2 presenters, and one is a comment. Let me start with the comment to Elliot. And maybe this really is very irrelevant. As I was thinking and listening about your discussion on the concept of the monster, the scary, the frightening character, and the construction thereof, I was tempted to think of the reverse situation, and where the normal, so to speak, or whatever is constructed as normal, is the marginal and the outsider, and my reference is as old as I am. The reference that came to mind was, of course, the Planet of Apes, where the monster, from our human perspective, is the mainstream, and we, mostly white male characters, I mean, they are the heroes in the movie, are the threat, are on the margin. Are there examples like that that turn sort of the narrative that you're interested in a little bit of upside down, that would be more contemporary, is more recent than the Planet of Apes? And if so, is this something that you find interesting to relate to, or maybe this is a question as silly as you would expect from a political scientist? And my other question, my other comment really is to Issam and Sara. And in different ways, both of you related to a concept that I think could have a lot of currency in your research, and that's leadership. So let me start with Sara. Sara, you mentioned several times, and you showed the picture, that the story of the Bat Mitzvah group, the story of the Women's Learning Circle, really couldn't have happened in any other synagogue, in any other setting. Rabbinic leadership, and you showed the image of Rabbi Joseph in the background, and Professor Norma Joseph was, I think if I recognized her, she was in the corner, humbly standing next to the rabbi. Rabbinic leadership had a lot, if not everything, to do with encouraging, facilitating, and creating room for the story to unfold. In other words, the friendships may not have had developed, and the programming not being created by the authority that the rabbi in that particular context gave it. And so why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I'm a political scientist and leadership matters to me. I'm interested in it, but I also think that that is an important part of the narrative. Now, you may choose not to tell it that way, but I think there is a room for that to be noted. So it's not just about a community, but communities also have individuals who are steering them, if you will, or not. Other rabbinic leaders, as you correctly pointed it out or alluded to it, might have put the brakes on this kind of development, might not have encouraged and facilitated the kind of empowerment of women that you so eloquently described. And that then thereafter, of course, it became self-fulfilling and self-enforcing, as you have seen in your recent conversations with Gladys, that she just became a magnet and she could even continue with the program in the COVID reality. And of course, leadership, Issam, is, you alluded to it in response to the question with respect to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but of course, he's not the only leader who plays a role in managing the current chapter of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And really, I will just leave it at that, just to say and maybe invite you to tease us, either now, if you want to engage that, or later on in the dissertation, just think about the concept of leadership, because really that relationship since 1967 has been managed, the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian, the various Palestinian political movements, and today, of course, we talk about the PA, has been managed by different leadership dyads. And of course, even before 67, but you're really focusing on post-1967. And that matters, that it matters who the Israeli leader is, with what kind of an ideology and solution presents, and who is leading the various Palestinian political factions or the umbrella movement, and today the authority, and with what kinds of solution concepts in his toolkit. So now maybe leadership is not interesting the way you want to tell the story, but I think it's an important part of it. And of course, it becomes even more fascinating in Canada, where, as you said, there is no, I mean, there is an umbrella. Well, Dr. Sally can correct me if I'm wrong, but you stress the problem of the First Nations of Canada just being so many, if you will, and so fragmented, that coordinating a common position vis-a-vis Canada, or even the Canadian establishment, is even more difficult. So maybe there is a room in your project to highlight the role of leadership, or maybe that's just not relevant because you want to focus more on international law, and that is perfectly fine. So I'll stop right there. If you have any quick comments, reactions.
If you allow me just 1 minute.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, about leadership, as I said now, about Benjamin Netanyahu, but I'm gonna go back in 1988. Without the leadership of Yasser Arafat, the Oslo Agreement will not have it. So 1994, we signed an Oslo Agreement, Yasser Arafat and Ishaq Rabin. So at that time, we had two leadership. They were able to hammer the deal. 1995, unfortunately, Ishaq Rabin were murdered. We know the reason why they killed him. And 1996, here the terminal points. We still have Arafat, and we have a real leadership in Israel side when Benjamin Netanyahu came to power in 1996, and he formed the government with extremist parties. So as I know, you are working more about parties and coalition restrictions, so you understand what you mean in ruling in coalitions with right wings parties. This means you have to go for either status quo or even worse. So that's what's happening now. In 2000, we have the second Intifada, which is been for 10 years. We have today we have a lack of leadership. So start with Benjamin Netanyahu is not is the main obstacle for me, and I'm sure I hear it from Jew activists. They told me we know that he's for the problem, and in Palestinian side we have very weak leadership, even corrupted leadership, and now Mahmoud Abbas is not legitimate as a leader. So, which is another point we need. I need to focus on it, that and leadership is important, and without the existence of leadership in both sides, not one, we need both, and not be able to achieve any progress in this file. And unfortunately, the situation is getting more and more and more complicated. And the funny thing is, here in Canada, the Canadian government love status quo because they can't find a solution for this issue. So let's leave it as it is for the future. And in Palestine, it's getting more and more complicated with the absence of real leadership in both sides. And I want to draw your attention about very important fact that you know that Hamas, 2 or 3 years ago, they accepted the border of 1967. They said they unofficially accepted. So still, absent a strong leadership in Palestinian one, and the core element in the Israeli side, what I call it coalition restriction, since Netanyahu, his whole allies within the right wings, and these people do not believe in two-state solutions, and he will not sacrifice, if he willing to do that, his positions just to have a deal with the Palestinians, and he loves the status quo. So if you look in the last 7 years, since 2014 until 2021, around 7 years, it was like ceasefire, nothing happening until he lost the opportunity to form a government. Then he pulled out this issue to let's make it burn. I don't know how he's gonna do it. This is the puzzles of my paper, how the right of self-determination will be implemented for these two groups. I'm sure that no one is know how it can be implemented.
Thank you, Issam. Any comments from Elliot, Sara? You don't have to. It's just.
Yeah, I can say a bit. There are certainly examples of what you're talking about, and I don't think it was a silly question or comment at all. One of the major kind of turns that we see in the 20th century in terms of monster narratives is this move more toward a kind of allyship with the monstrous versus the normate. And so a lot of even the materials I grew up with as a child, cartoons and those sorts of things in the late 80s, early 90s, kind of position the monster as the figure, as the hero, and often the villain will be somebody who's sort of, a straight white man, this kind of thing. In terms of more recent media, the one that came to mind right away was something like The Shape of Water, Guillermo del Toro's film, won the Oscar a few years back, which of course positions its marginalized heroes who all rally around this monster character based on the creature from the Black Lagoon in order to kind of rescue him from the clutches of the American government, which is kind of represented by this one kind of white straight man who is the main antagonist, and it sort of reflects on these themes and kind of puts forward this idea of, well, humanity was the real monster all along, which has, I'm putting it in this really kind of trite way, but has sort of recurred in fiction for quite a while now. So yeah, that paradigm shift has definitely happened. We see more of that. And it's kind of being identified as a major paradigm shift in terms of how the monster is represented, but particularly in terms of how the antagonists of monsters are represented, and raises the question of, where does real monstrosity lie? And instead of sort of implying that it's something physical that we can see, that instead it's something immaterial that is a kind of moral corruption. I would argue that carries its own problems, and typically such attempts to decouple it from physicality and a kind of monstrous physicality are largely unsuccessful. So for instance, even in contemporary media, that's like, hey, this white dude is the antagonist and he's actually the moral monster. Often that character, even if he starts out as sort of a stereotypically handsome man, and all of these sorts of things, becomes disabled over the course of the film, or turns out to be coded as queer in some way. And so those same kind of like ideas actually recur that the film is on the surface rejecting, or the book or whatever particular medium we're talking about is rejecting, actually recur, and in fact get doubled down on a lot. So just a very, very recent example, the film The Witches, which was a remake of the adaptation from, I think, 1992 of the Roald Dahl novel of the same name. We have the child protagonist is played by a Black actor, and it follows his family, and the antagonist is a white woman. But over the course of the story, it's revealed that she sort of, got a physical disability. She has 3 fingers, and a lot of disabled viewers of the film, particularly young disabled viewers, were actually quite upset by this sort of revelation, which isn't something that's there in the original text. It's not something that was there in the 1992 film. And so any kind of political statement it was trying to make about whiteness and Blackness there kind of gets subsumed beneath this, discourse of disability that still positions disability as the marker for monstrosity. Moral monstrosity still ultimately becomes reflected in the body. So, are we successfully actually moving away from this? It's a bit unclear, but certainly there's a shift. So, yeah, so I think it was a great point to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you for engaging. Great. Sarah, if you have any last words to share, those are yours, but you don't have to. It's no pressure.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to your question. Thank you for that. I think I'll give sort of a 2-pronged answer. I think that, first of all, what you're pointing to regarding the role of the rabbis, it was actually, there's 2 rabbis who were involved in the women's learning group. It was Rabbi Joseph and then Rabbi Orenstein. I think that is sort of part of what I was addressing when I was referring to Judith Plaskow's assertion that it's a complicated balancing act to strive for modes of Jewish expression which negotiate between contemporary ethical sensibilities and also a sense of loyalty to tradition. I think that's a perfect explanation or a perfect framing to understand what's happening, because the rabbis indeed were incredibly important, I think, in the forming of the group. But there's also this strength of leadership that came from Gladys, that she chose to take this on, that she chose to keep it up. So I think that, first of all, it's a balancing act. And I think that this is perhaps a unique context, but on the other hand, I would argue that this balancing act is taking place in many Jewish spaces all over the place right now. Even as you can see from this example, even in Orthodox spaces. So I think it is a tension that exists. And then the second prong to my answer is that I would also challenge the way that you are framing the relationships between these people, because I think that part of my focus on friendship is also a focus on relationships and the way in which connection and relation allow for the creation of social groups and social events and a cohesive kind of community. So I think that it's the way that I view it is that Gladys was really a partner with these rabbis. I don't view it that the rabbis led the group and then Gladys sort of took that on eventually. I view it that really from the beginning they were partners and they were working in relation to each other. And the rabbis certainly brought I think they bring a sense of authority, which probably facilitated the eventual sort of legitimization of the group within the synagogue. But there was also this crucial leadership from Gladys, and also I think in framing it as I do as a network of relationships, I would say that there's also leadership from all of the members. I think it's sort of I think it's, I find it valuable to think about it in a way of breaking down the hierarchy and really seeing it as a horizontal network of relationships that allow this to take place. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. And I think the last word is going to go to Professor Joseph. Norma, let me just unmute you. Norma, I think you're muted.
I thought I unmuted. Okay, I'm unmuted.
Now you're good. Now you're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to, I support what Sara said, but in a classic leadership model, perhaps, I understand the horizontal model, I support that, but in a classic model, one would still see the rabbis as supportive and not the leaders. They did not innovate, they did not lead, they did not call this into action. They supported, they allowed to occur, but in fact, Gladys was always and everywhere and only the leader. The rabbis allowed her. When she came to them with the idea, they said, oh, what a nice idea. Okay, we'll think about it. Okay, we'll let you. The women did not come to be with the rabbis. They came to be with Gladys, and it has always been Gladys as the leader. So even in a horizontal and hierarchical model, it would be Gladys you would describe there, and then the rabbis as this little offshoot, allowing, not even enabling, but allowing. And when she would call on them, they would say, yes, you can do this, or oh, yes, I'll come and give a lecture, or I'll play my guitar. But it was always and only Gladys as the leader, and you can't in any way take it away from her. And that's why Sara focused this talk on her. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Lucas, Elliot, Sara, Issam, you've been wonderful. And we wish you, like I said before, all good luck and much, much success in your continued scholarly progress and endeavors. Would also like to thank all the professors from the two departments and from the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, especially members of the advisory group who dedicated this time to show their support and their commitment to our students by attending our 2021 Montefiore Award recipient scholarly seminar. So thank you. And last but certainly not least, I would also like to say a huge thank you to our staff members, Jennifer Solomon and Lisa Komlos, who were instrumental in organizing, implementing, and advertising on the various social media this important event. Norma, I see that you raised your hand again, or is that a clap? I think your hand is okay. So I am now going to call this event to its closure. So no more virtual hands will be recognized. Looking forward to reading the next versions, stages of your dissertation and other conference papers that you will be preparing from your research. And have a wonderful summer, and above all, stay healthy. And let's make sure that this COVID period is going to be behind us sooner rather than later. Have a great summer, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.